Hi, this is Daniel Miller. I work with NASCO, and today we're talking about the Fair Housing Act and how it applies to your co-op. We talked a little bit about who it is that's protected from discrimination, what are the things that are protected from discrimination. We talked about what we mean when we say discrimination, legally speaking. We talked a little bit about how it is that the Fair Housing Act is enforced and investigated. And today I want to talk a little bit about some things that your co-op can do to make sure that you can have some control over your membership process, but also make sure that your membership process doesn't violate the law unintentionally. So some recommended policies for your co-op to start looking at with the Fair Housing Act. And just to be clear, these aren't about changing your membership process. These are just about making sure that your membership process is clear and documented so that nobody can accuse your co-op of doing something discriminatory. So as far as, the first step to dealing with a vacancy in your co-op and to finding a new member is to do some advertising or to do some outreach. So the first thing to know is when you're doing that marketing, just do not state a preference in your ads for applicants from any underrepresented group. This is typically where co-ops might get into trouble because you're trying to be inclusive and you're trying to make sure that your co-op does outreach, but that might accidentally get phrased as we will prefer members from the following racial groups, genders, gender identities, sexual orientations, religious groups, etc. So you want to make sure instead to say that you are encouraging people to come and apply, and that's perfectly fine. Just not stating a preference saying that you would take this person over that person. You also want to make sure that the content of your ads is relevant to the mission of your co-op and the work that you do. So ideally, you don't want to have a picture of 10 people standing in front of your garden because that's your goal isn't to have those 10 people in a garden. Your goal might be affordable housing. Your goal might be educational housing for students. Your goal might be to promote environmental sustainability in your community. So you want to make sure that any images that you're using are relevant to that and tell that story. That's not just something that's going to keep you from being sued or accused of discrimination. It's also something that's going to make sure that the members who are coming and applying to your co-op are doing it because they're excited about the work that the co-op does. And so if you tell that story about your mission for environmental sustainability and all of the ways that you do that, then you're going to get people who are excited about that. It's a common mistake for co-ops to think about this as entirely about somebody who's coming and joining a community, but the way the law looks at you is going to be to say that you are a provider of housing that is open to the general public. And so you're going to want to make sure that the images you use in your advertising are also focusing on what it is that the housing you provide looks like. So if you have pictures of the room that is available, if you have pictures of the facilities so that somebody can come and look at that, and so they're going to understand what the mission of the co-op is, they're going to understand what it is that's being offered to them. The other thing about the demographics of the co-op or the culture of the co-op is that that's something that's going to change over time. It's not necessarily set in stone. So you're sort of showing a picture of what the culture of the co-op was a year ago, and that doesn't tell somebody what it is that they're getting themselves into and what the co-op can offer to them as a member. Something else that's really important about your membership policies and being compliant with the Fair Housing Act is that you want to explain your process. So you want to explain your membership policy to anybody who's applying to the co-op as early as possible. You might want to have a frequently asked questions document that talks about your membership process and it's part of your advertisement, or you link to it in your advertisement. You might want to have that elevator pitch where you can explain your membership policy in a minute or less as you're walking around giving a tour to somebody who's applying to the co-op. You definitely want to make sure to show every available room if you're giving a tour, because if you don't show every available room, somebody might feel like, well, they showed me this room over here, but not this one. I think this one they didn't show me was nicer. Why did they only show me the cheaper room, or the room that wasn't as nice, or the room that needed to be fixed up? So just take that sort of doubt out of the process entirely. Show every person who's applying all of the available rooms. If you're not able to get into that room, maybe somebody's in that room right now and they haven't moved out yet, then try to get a photo of that room so that you can show what all of the rooms are. You certainly at least want to show something about those rooms. You want to be able to describe those rooms. You want to list every room that's available. And if you're living in an apartment co-op, then just do the same for every unit and not every room. You want to make sure that you explain the application process during your meetings. That's just not only to the person who's applying, but also to the members. Because again, your co-op isn't set in stone. The people who are your members are going to change over time. You may have people in this meeting who have never been a part of a membership acceptance process, or have only been on this side of the process once or twice. So it really helps to make sure to explain the process during the meeting with everybody there to hear it, so that everybody's on the same page and they understand that when we sit down for this meeting to talk about this membership application, this is how that process is going to flow. And so if you ask somebody to leave the room for 5 minutes while you take a vote, make sure to say that ahead of time. If you are going to contact them next week to let them know what happened, make sure to say that ahead of time. You don't want there to be any surprises in this process. I think something else that's important to keep in mind for your co-op is that a person who feels that they have been marginalized in their housing choices in the past may be very sensitive to being treated in a way that they feel is marginalizing. You may not intend to marginalize them with your membership process, but it may be that they have experiences that give them a very good reason to feel that they were treated discriminatorily, even if it wasn't your intent. So if you can avoid those surprises and just say this is how the process works at the very start, and that process is consistent for everybody who comes and applies to the co-op, then your members are going to get better at the process and get better at doing what it is that you say you're doing and that you want to do, instead of getting caught up in the moment, and instead of accidentally saying something inappropriate or giving the impression that somebody was treated unfairly. You're also going to want to make sure in your meeting that you clearly state the criteria for membership before the decisions. And ideally, you're going to state all of the forbidden criteria. So for example, earlier we talked about the Fair Housing Act, and that across the US, race, color, nationality, family status, disability, gender, and religion, those are illegal as membership criteria anywhere in the US. So definitely you want to say in your meetings, these are things that should not come up in the discussion. They're not appropriate things to talk about in deciding whether or not somebody can move in here. One thing that's important to think about is it's not just about whether or not you denied somebody housing because of their gender, for example. But even if your co-op feels this is not why you rejected somebody, be aware that if you spent time talking about that, then that person may feel like it is why you decided not to accept them as a member. So that's why it's best that those things should just not even be on the table as subjects for conversation. One of the things that we recommend to co-ops is that you should have some printed material, ideally on the wall of the room where you have your meetings, that say, these are the things that we require of a member, and these are the things that we will never consider in a membership decision. So that if somebody accidentally starts talking about this person's religion or their gender, then other people in the room can say that is not an appropriate subject for this conversation about their membership application, and they can point to that poster on the wall. So that's a thing that can keep your process grounded in what is and is not legal in terms of housing discrimination law. You're going to want to make sure that your membership process has really clear criteria. So that means, first off, just avoid subjective reasons. Don't say that you didn't accept somebody because they're creepy or they wouldn't fit in, they wouldn't be happy here. Do a better job of being specific about your reasons for rejecting somebody. It's possible that somebody thought this person was creepy and they meant something illegal or inappropriate, right? They might have meant this person was older or of a different racial background, or something else that is not an appropriate reason to reject somebody's membership. But it may be that there's a very valid reason. Maybe when they say they wouldn't fit in, they don't mean they're of a different demographic background. Maybe they mean this person spoke to members of the co-op disrespectfully during the meeting and acted in a way that led people to believe that they would be unsafe to have in the house or continue to be disrespectful or to denigrate other members based on their traits or their backgrounds, right? And so that's a perfectly legitimate reason not to accept somebody, but you want to be able to get good at stating those reasons in a clear and objective way. One of the things to think about is if somebody were to say, I think that the co-op discriminated against me because of my race, for example, and then the co-op says, no, that's not what we did. We discriminated against you because you wouldn't fit in. Well, that's a really difficult decision to defend. Whereas if you say, we didn't accept your membership application because you had expressed that you would have a difficult time attending meetings and because of statements that you made that were disrespectful to other members, that's a really easy thing to defend. So you just want to make sure to get out of those subjective reasons and into something that's clear. You want to make sure that you put the result of all of your membership admissions or rejections decisions in writing. That's not the same thing as publishing it or sharing it with the person or anything else, but you do want to have it in writing. If the co-op is accused of acting in a discriminatory way, you want to be able to take that document and show it and say, this was the date of our meeting where we made this decision. This was the decision that was made. These are the reasons for that decision, and this is how it went. So you want to be able to very clearly and objectively explain why it is that you made your decision. You also want to make sure that you get better at talking about what it is that would make a good or a bad member. So I mentioned earlier, maybe that person said something during their interview or during their tour of the house that was seen as disrespectful of other members. Well, that's actually probably a pretty good criteria. You want to say that you want to have members who can act respectfully of people of different backgrounds so that you can have a safe environment for people to live in and not feel that they'll be singled out because of some personal trait. So that's the sort of thing that you want to say. These are the traits that we're looking for in a member, and these are the things that we want. And also to say these are the things that would be a problem, right? If somebody threatened another person, then, well, that seems pretty clear that our co-op doesn't want that person to move in. If this person says that they think meetings are stupid and they'll never come to them, well, that's also probably a pretty good reason not to accept them. So I mentioned earlier that you want to commit that decision to writing. Without that record of decisions, it's incredibly difficult for the co-op to prove why a decision was made a certain way if a complaint comes up. And this is something that we've seen in co-ops where there was an accusation of discriminatory practice, and the co-op felt very clearly that they did not act in a discriminatory way. And it may be that they were 100% right. They definitely did nothing inappropriate. Maybe their decision was exactly what it should have been, but they had no records of that decision. And so at that point, you have one party saying, I was treated in a discriminatory way by the co-op, and the co-op says, nuh-uh, that's not what we did. So you really want to make sure that you're documenting these things, because nuh-uh, that's not what we did just isn't going to hold up. Think about this as from the perspective of how a judge, for example, would look at this, or an attorney who is looking at this complaint would look at it. They would either see that you have a reason that you can explain, or they'd see you saying, no, that's not how it went, and you have no real evidence to back that up. You have no clearer explanation. I think one of the other things to keep in mind is that this process can be slow. It might be 6 months between when this person showed up at a meeting and you receiving notice that they felt they were treated discriminatorily. And so in that 6 months, who knows what could happen? Everybody's memories get a little fuzzier over time. Maybe the people who were involved in that decision moved out, but the co-op is still there. And so the co-op is still going to be held responsible for that decision, even if the people who made that decision are gone. And so by keeping a record of these things, you can make sure that the co-op as an organization has that memory over time. Ideally, that record is something that could be signed by an officer related to membership, so that the meeting chair signs it or the membership officer signs it. Somebody who is involved can put their name to it and sign it and date it and say that on the 14th of November, this person came to a meeting and we rejected their membership application for the following reasons. Ideally, that record should show the final vote. If your co-op uses a consensus system and not a voting system, then show the test for consensus for the decision. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to show each person who felt a certain way one way or another, but it does mean that the gist of the conversation that led to your decision should be recorded, and that the general outcome of the vote should be recorded. This was a unanimous decision. This was a vote with 2 abstentions, that sort of thing. So these don't have to be public records. They can be something that live in a filing cabinet in your co-op's living room, and they never go anywhere. But they should be available to defend the co-op's decision if you need to. So it's possible that you could get a subpoena where you have to produce these documents. But in general, the issue is going to be that you do or do not have these documents to defend your actions. You want to notify the applicant. So one thing you could consider is to just have a standard letter if an applicant is rejected. It can be really short and factual and give very little information. We're sorry, but we can't offer you a room at this time. Or we're sorry, we don't have a space available for you. We encourage you to come back at some other time. So it can be very, very brief. It doesn't have to go into detail. But you do want to make sure to let them know what the co-op's decision was. You want to do that in writing, and you want to do it fairly quickly. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a person who's looking for housing. They need a place to live, and if the co-op takes several weeks to process the decision-making process, that can feel really disrespectful to a person. Another thing is that co-ops can move more slowly than an apartment complex, for example. So if they've applied to 10 different places to live, and the co-op's process is just so much slower and more involved, there might be very good reasons for that. They might also feel that it was disrespectful or that something wasn't right here because they're comparing you to these other options that they're applying for. So just make sure to give somebody a letter in writing that factually states that they're not going to get a room at this time. If somebody says, can you tell me a little bit more about why I wasn't accepted? I really thought we got along great at the meeting. I was really excited about moving into the co-op. You could consider giving them some more detail. You would definitely want to say what you did not consider in the decision. And that can be a really boring sort of boilerplate that goes at the end of the letter, right? Our co-op does not base membership decisions on race, religion, nationality, gender, blah, blah, blah. That's perfectly acceptable. You just want to make sure to say that the co-op is aware of these obligations and it is something that you take seriously. It is not a part of your membership criteria. But you could say a little bit more about why not. Well, you expressed that you would have a difficult time coming to meetings, and that's something that makes it very difficult for our co-op to democratically function with people not participating in meetings, right? So you might be a little bit more detailed, but you don't have to be. You want to make sure that your co-op has some sort of appeals process if somebody feels like the co-op incorrectly rejected their membership application. You want to make sure that the appeal process is based on the facts of why the applicant was rejected. So if you said in your decision that this was the reason why you weren't accepting that person should be able to find out specifically what your decision was based on and then address those specific facts. And so if your co-op said, we felt from your interview that you would be unable or unwilling to come to our meetings, and that's why we rejected you, that's a legitimate reason not to accept somebody. But you might not be right about that assumption. And so they should have a chance to say, no, I think you misunderstood what I said about my work schedule. I would be able to come to the meetings. Or I would make sure to read the meeting minutes, even if I'm not available. I would be sure to write something if somebody had a question for me, right? So you want to make sure that they have a chance to respond to the reasoning for your decision. Something that's important about an appeals process is that if a co-op applicant feels that they can address the issue within the co-op and that they'll get a fair chance to discuss the issue, they're less likely to bring a complaint from outside the co-op. You know, one of the things to keep in mind is the co-op can be wrong. You should be humble about this decision. You should try to be aware of the gravity of the decision that you're making. You did deny somebody housing. You might have very good reasons that are completely defensible and are the right thing to do, but be aware that this is probably a decision that you made that is important in their life. So if they feel like the co-op is a reasonable and fair group of people who are aware of their responsibilities and are not acting in a discriminatory way, then they're less likely to bring a legal complaint against you or to make a legal threat or to have their uncle who's an attorney call you. So those are all things that you want to avoid. Make sure that you invite them to the co-op and to come and speak about your process. It might also be something that the co-op finds as really valuable as a learning lesson about how your process is perceived from outside, or how your membership criteria stack up in the real world as people start coming to your co-op and applying for spaces. So just be aware that you want to invite that feedback.